Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympianship of Reconciliation. For nearly 27 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. For decades now, Congress and presidents of both of the big parties have been pushing for, quote, free trade, unquote, schemes that promise jobs and prosperity, but have actually resulted in the opposite. For example, Bill Clinton, who ran as a Democrat, pushed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the expansion of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. George W. Bush started pushing for a free trade scheme that would include many Pacific Rim nations, and Barack Obama has pushed George W. Bush's free trade scheme even further. And that's what we'll be talking about mostly during this program. Mainstream politicians, mainstream news media typically assume that these free trade schemes are good, and they fail to adequately address the other side. This month's TV program will consider the other side. We need truly fair trade instead of so-called free trade. I'm delighted to welcome Kristen Bifus, Executive Director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, which is based in Seattle and consists of 66 varied organizations. Good to have you here, Kristen.
For having us.
Kristen and her organization and many other people and organizations are working hard to protect our jobs, our environment, and our democracy from giant corporations that would use a dangerous new free trade scheme to gain power and money at the expense of the broad public interest. So we have a lot to talk about, and this will be fun.
We do.
I want to start out in a kind of a larger context. To make better decisions about economics, we need to question some of the assumptions that policies that have been hurting our economy for so many years. Before we can consider the pros and cons of free trade, I want the American people to think about free markets more clearly as a concept. Mainstream politicians and news media keep assuming that a free market is the best way to handle any problem. And what do you think?
Well, I think there's this idea that a free market is unrestrained and has a certain naturalness to it, that goods and services will just flow and the market determine the value, where actually even those that advocate for so-called free markets or neoliberal economic theory don't actually acknowledge themselves that there are there's supports and subsidies within, and it just depends on who is who's benefiting from those subsidies. And so in many ways, our markets, corporations are supported in our current markets. They're not free at all. I just want to challenge that concept of free markets. And then as you go down, then trade agreements that are predicated on that sort of ideology are broken.
Yeah. It occurs to me also that a lot of things are not well suited to a free market. You can't sell your children. You can't buy a slave. You can't sell your vote, put out a notice and have the different politicians bid up how much they would pay for your vote. A lot of things just do not work well in a free market. Slavery was a good example of that. And so I think we need to sort out as a society what things have overriding values and ethics that would not be susceptible to that kind of a brutal free market, let alone the fact that it's not even free to start with because of what you've talked about.
Well, and historically, we in the U.S. and other countries have protected domestic enterprises, and protecting them for a reason so that they can foster and grow. A small child, the beginning of a business needs certain built-in markets and incentives for people to purchase things locally. And then once it's more of an adult, it's able to be a bit more on its own. However, what we're seeing is ongoing protectionism for corporations.
Right, even big ones.
Especially
especially
global
big ones.
multinationals. Absolutely.
A lot of the people and the institutions promoting free markets and free trade are also promoting privatization. And what do you think about privatization?
Well, privatization, and we're seeing privatization not only of the things we might imagine of our natural resources, of water, of land, but we're also seeing privatization of our public policy making in general, where you have corporate funds, corporate resources going into our elections, going into policy making. And so we're seeing privatization in spaces that the public's voice needs to be heard, because privatization acts out the debate, cuts out the very democracy that policy should be based on.
Yeah, well, a good example of what you just said is that when the 2010 federal health care bill was being developed, the Senate version of that bill had large portions written by insurance companies. And more, like you say, the policy making, the legislation is actually written by the corporations that stand to benefit by it. And ordinary folks, I mean, I didn't have a voice in writing that and anything else.
Absolutely. Well, and the number of paid lobbyists that are in the process, absolutely. And with trade, it's even to an extreme.
Yeah. Big business corporations overall have been grabbing more wealth and power, including the concept of corporate personhood. And maybe some of our viewers aren't quite remembering what the concept of corporate personhood means. Can you just refresh their memories?
Sure. Well, also it's very helpful for me to did that historically corporations have not had the power they have now, and that actually there was a point in time, we have to go pretty far back in our history, when corporations were very regulated and weren't able to influence elections, weren't able. They were established for the public good, especially to promote public works, and over time, through using the courts and using different laws to promote themselves, they've gained more and more power, all the way up to the recent Citizens United case, where corporations are now given equal stature as people in their ability to influence elections, give to elections. However, they have a lot more power than the average person.
Right. Well, and for people trying to grapple with the concept of corporate personhood, the idea is, as a person, I can enter into contracts. As a person, I have free speech. As a person, I have all kinds of things as rights and functions. When a corporation, a business incorporates, it becomes a body. I mean, that's the Latin root. Incorporated, it becomes a body, and then that body has been endowed through kind of slippery legal reasoning to have the rights of a human body, and to the point where they can then not only enter into contracts and do things, but the Supreme Court has been giving them rights that are under the Constitution, really intended for people.
Absolutely.
And
ending political campaigns
Yeah.
is one of the biggest outcomes
Right.
of it. And we've seen a
Yeah.
huge influx since that decision of money just going into different political campaigns. And then they've de facto bought that elected
Yeah.
official.
Yeah, and in contrast to ordinary people who are mortal, we will sometimes die, but those giant corporations will live forever. So they actually have more power than we do, and that's frightening for democracy.
Well, and as we talk about in our trade agreements, I know we'll talk about that more, but the agreements are actually raising corporations to the level of statehood, where they're not only just one person, but representing, potentially a typical state could represent millions of people, and putting states and corporations on par. So they've become much more than just the average person or even collection of persons, but actually on par to be able to challenge countries when they don't like their rules and regulations.
And overrule them, and we'll talk about that in a few
Absolutely.
minutes. Yeah. So for a number of decades now, national governments have been passing free trade schemes like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Can you explain anything else about the free trade concepts that are underlying these and the general principles of how like WTO and NAFTA actually operate?
Absolutely. Well, we have 20 years of NAFTA. January is the anniversary.
Yeah, it was January 1st of 1994.
Exactly. And so we've been living under NAFTA for 20 years, and people can trace many of the experience they've been having around job loss and recession and manufacturing. We've lost millions of manufacturing jobs because what has happened under these trade agreements is the idea, the promises are that they will, so with NAFTA, it's 3 countries, right? It's Canada, the US, and Mexico. And the promise of President Clinton was that it would stabilize the economy in Mexico and people would be able to find jobs, living wage jobs in their communities. And then similarly, it would a market for producers in the US. And so when the tariffs got lowered, what we saw happening is corporations realizing, well, they can just move to Mexico and they can import things back and there's no tariff, there's nothing holding them back. And whether it was agriculture or manufacturing, they came in and it created a destabilization for the people in Mexico. And it's actually, led to increased forced migration with people leaving, and then also people here losing work in manufacturing. And then that's less money coming in to our public entities funding all of the basic programs that we have here in Washington.
It weakens the tax base when these corporations move their factories just across the border into these maquiladoras, these free trade manufacturing areas in Mexico. There's a lot of the appliances, refrigerators and
Electronics
ovens and stuff being made in Mexico just across the border, and so all those jobs for us went away. And side of it that people often don't think about is that the United States still subsidizes our grains. And so the corn, the United States corn growers can send corn down to Mexico, and Mexico can't stop it. And we undercut the prices that Mexican farmers would be able to get by growing and selling corn. So they become unemployed, and then they have to go work in the sweatshops or migrate to the United States, which antagonizes people in the United States. So to a large extent, the immigration difficulties that we're having with Mexico have come about because of NAFTA, because we made it impossible for farming communities and farmers to keep their own economies going.
Absolutely. And just to add, obviously Mexico, birthplace of corn, and it's not just corn, but it's GMO corn now.
Yeah, genetically modified.
Absolutely. And as you say, farmers are pushed either into factory farms where they're just workers, they don't own any of the, or as you say, the maquiladora sector. And we hear this term outsourcing a lot, and we have kind of debunked that myth of outsourcing because it gives this idea of a good job moving somewhere else, where actually a good job is lost in the U.S. And as you mentioned, the maquiladora sector, sweatshop. So it's a sweatshop job that's being created, a poverty wage job that's being created. So when there's talk of job creation, you can argue, yes, NAFTA created jobs, but not the jobs that we want to be creating, really those poverty jobs.
Yeah, well, and if you look at what kinds of jobs we're losing and gaining in the United States, you lose a manufacturing job that pays a good union wage, and the job that's created is flipping burgers part-time at McDonald's, and they're not equivalent.
Exactly.
And yet the statistics from those supporting those kinds of schemes would say, oh yeah, we broke even on jobs, you know.
Well, that's where so many of our elected officials say the rationale for more and more trade agreements like NAFTA, and then after NAFTA, right, the attempt at WTO expansion. There was CAFTA, which is the Central America Free Trade Agreement, and then there have been these bilateral agreements, and the excuse always is jobs. We need to increase exports for jobs.
Right, and Obama just a couple of years ago pushed through a free trade deal with South Korea, and one with Panama, and one with Colombia. And Colombia, for a number of years, has had the world's very worst record of murdering labor organizers and union members, the worst record in the whole world of that, and there's nothing in writing to protect that, but Obama got a verbal agreement, or a verbal promise from the president of Colombia that they would do better.
And just recently, we're less than 2 years into that agreement, and literally just in September, farmers took to the streets in Colombia where they were literally dumping their dairy and dumping their crops because they said that prices have gotten so low they can't compete, and that their livelihood, they have no livelihoods. And so again, created more economic destabilization in a country that was already politically unstable.
There's another consequence that some people have been mentioning just lately about we have local communities that want to protect their environment by, say, passing an ordinance that says you can't do fracking, you know, pump these toxic chemicals and and so forth under the ground to extract oil or natural gas. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Quebec had passed an anti-fracking law?
Not even anti-fracking, it was just a timeout on fracking so that they could actually research it more.
That's right, it wasn't a permanent ban, it was
just a moratorium.
A moratorium on fracking. And a company under NAFTA, right, a company that supposedly is a US company, wanted to frack underneath the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, and Quebec says, no, you can't do this moratorium, this timeout. And that company, that US corporation under NAFTA, is threatening to sue Quebec for $250 million. So all of a sudden, you can't even pass a law in your own province without being sued under NAFTA. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we're talking about makes things even worse.
Absolutely. So it's in the investor state chapter of NAFTA, and it allows a corporation to sue a country, not vice versa. A country cannot sue. In this case, you mentioned Lone Pines, which is the company, and it had
I didn't remember the company's name.
It had been talked about because it has a subsidiary in Delaware, but when you actually trace it back, it is based in Alberta. And so it's actually a Canadian company.
But they're using the NAFTA.
They created their subsidiary in the U.S. to sue their own country. And we think this might actually be precedent setting. I don't know that there has been another case. There's been cases of subsidiaries being used, but not, because while it's a Quebec law, they are suing Canada. And so Canada has to decide whether.
It's the whole country? Oh, I thought they were just suing Quebec.
No, because it's the whole country that's part of NAFTA. And that's where it puts this pressure on. So Canada, using taxpayer money, can decide, well, we're going to defend Quebec, or they could say to Quebec, hey, we really don't want to, we don't have the resources,
Yeah.
and we need you to just lift that moratorium. And so that's where, as you said so eloquently, communities can do incredible organizing.
Yeah.
They can pass laws around, I mean, or even pauses just to get good scientific data.
Yeah.
And this company, they're suing not only for their initial investment, but they sue for potential profits.
Right.
And whoever can judge a potential profit, I mean, you and I can't really
Well,
predict
you
what any
inflate
profits
you
will
inflate
have.
the number,
Exactly.
and you ask for gigantic damages.
Exactly.
What the litigation strategy is. Well, the related thing is the dolphin safe tuna label.
Labeling.
You know, able to get through Congress some years ago, the provision that on cans of tuna there'd be a little insignia showing that the tuna was caught with some care, so that we weren't unnecessarily catching and killing dolphins at the same time.
Okay.
And there's a Mexican tuna fishing company that really did not give a damn about killing dolphins and didn't want to be judged negatively in the free trade world. And they said, well, that having that label there sort of implies there's something wrong with killing dolphins. And so they sued through the WTO, right? Mm-hmm. And they won. And so that dolphin safe tuna label is going to get phased out. I think it's in 2014. Is that what the expiration date is? But here's a case where an unscrupulous, grossly insensitive Mexican tuna fishing company can overrule a U.S. act of Congress. And that's under WTO, and this Trans-Pacific Partnership that we'll be talking about along is like that kind of thing, only even more extreme.
So under our trade agreements, a product is a product is a product. And it doesn't matter the conditions in which that product was made or produced, because anything that tries to put, whether it's Buy American, or whether it's protecting dolphins, or whether it's a byproduct. I mean, there's so many cases we could talk about. However, it's seen as discriminating.
That's right.
And so under these trade agreements, you're not allowed to, whether a community or you're a government, to be able to say, well, actually the product, whether it's using sweatshop labor, or it's harming the environment, or it's poisoning water, that product should have the same access as a product that uses good union labor, that has important environmental protections. And that is one of the big problems with the current model of free trade agreements.
Well, and you mentioned like the buy local thing. I mean, we have states and communities that give a preference for buying products produced in your own state.
Right.
Or buy American, a preference in purchasing practices to buy products made in this country as opposed to elsewhere. And these things would overrule all of that.
They can be challenged. Yeah, Canada was not very happy with the Buy American focus during the recession, trying to encourage. And so, no, it can be a big issue. And we use it too, right? Our corporations do the same thing.
But again, it's the corporations making the decision, and the people and the workers and the environment just get whipsawed.
Right.
As the corporations yank us around in all kinds of ways. That leads us right into talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Perfect.
We talk about corporations yanking us around in all kinds of nasty ways. George W. Bush started it rolling, and when President Obama took office, he kept it going, and he's vigorously pushing it now, and then pushing fast track to get it approved without adequate congressional consideration. We'll talk about fast track in a few minutes, but what would the Trans-Pacific Partnership actually do? It includes the 3 NAFTA countries, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. We all have Pacific coasts, and 2 South American countries, Peru and Chile, and then a bunch of nations in the Pacific and bordering Pacific, Vietnam and Singapore, and a bunch of others.
Australia, New Zealand, Brunei. Japan just recently joined.
Oh, that's right.
And part of, so there's 12 countries in total, and it started out with fewer countries. At the end of last year, Canada and Mexico joined. This year, Japan joined. And part of what makes this such a monster is that countries in the Pacific Rim can continue to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Even after it goes into effect.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's...
So that's very new. We haven't seen that in any other trade deals.
Well, and then that has very dangerous implications, because modifying it, as I understand, requires consensus. So some country could join the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then be just a real jerk and not allow amendments or modifications that are necessary and practical and decent.
Well, they have to be under it, and that was something when Canada and Mexico joined, we were already, I think, into the 15th round of negotiations.
Yeah, we've up to like 18 rounds now?
19
like
have been completed, yeah. And so Canada had to, they came to the table sort of sight unseen, and they had to agree up front to anything that had been decided on, any chapter that had been closed, to be a part of it. And so now South Korea is talking about joining, and so they would have to come in and agree thing that had been agreed to by the other countries.
Okay. Let's talk about what some of the specific results and implications would occur if Congress were to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. What are some of the serious specific results and implications of if this were to pass?
Sure. Well, first of all, just to touch on the fact that it has been a very not transparent process.
Right, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
So, okay.
So this is like
so what we're sharing
it's a black
is,
box that we don't know what's in there, but
exactly.
somehow people do know what's in there.
So sort of linked text, and what we know is been in our trade agreements for the past 20 years.
Yeah.
We know the model hasn't changed that much. There's been little tweaks here and there, and we also know 600 corporations are at the table.
This is amazing because Congress has been prohibited from knowing what's in it. Meanwhile, 600 representatives from giant corporations, including some of the nastiest ones.
The Walmarts, the Cargills, the Monsantos, the big banks.
And the U.S. Trade Representative is a guy from Citigroup.
There's a new representative that was just appointed by President Obama, Michael Froman, and he hails from Citigroup.
So it's like the worst corporations, and you got 600 people from those kinds of entities and some governments, and they're doing this thing in secret, and Congress doesn't get to know about it.
Yeah, so Congress, now they have allowed Congress some sort of access, but it's a very controlled access where the corporate negotiators, they can go online and they can see what's being negotiated, where members of Congress have to go through special processes and then they're not allowed to talk about it with each other or their staff or anyone. And so it's really this veil, and even talking with past trade negotiators or past heads of USTR, under the Bush administration, for the Free Trade Area of the Americas, they put the text online. And so what they've been saying is, why hold the secrecy?
Yeah, especially when Obama had campaigned in 2008 for more transparency, and he's vastly more secretive than George W. Bush had been.
Well, he campaiged for the renegotiation of NAFTA.
That's right.
As well,
yeah.
in 2000.
That's another broken campaign
2008.
promise. Yeah.
So what we're hearing is that, first of all, there's some 29 chapters. Only a couple of them have to actually do with the goods and services flow.
Yeah, the trade.
The trade part of it.
Yeah, there's 29 chapters in a trade treaty, but hardly anything to do with trade. Everything else is this other
corporate rights.
Yeah,
as we refer to them.
Vast expansions of corporate rights and permitting additional abuses.
Exactly. So we've talked a little bit about the investor state chapter. There's also the intellectual property chapter, which would extend patents. So the big pharmaceutical companies are at the table. They're looking for a way to extend the patents on their drugs.
Right, and the viewers need to know that some of these drugs that are needed for like malaria and HIV/AIDS and stuff that in these poor countries, the patented drugs are horribly expensive that lots and lots and lots of people are dying, but there are some generics that can be made, and this would extend the patents and sharply reduce access of the world's poorest people to the drugs that they need to save their lives.
Exactly. Well, people here, you can think of your own experience, how we rely on generic medicines in so many of our health programs. And you think about someone who's making a couple dollars a day in Malaysia or in Vietnam. And some of the biggest resistance to the Trans-Pacific has been in the realm of global health, because so many of, as you say, the strides we've made in treating diseases such as malaria, HIV/AIDS, have been because we've been able to produce drugs and make them accessible. Because it's just not about producing the drugs; it's the people that need them the most can access them. And so in Malaysia, there's been huge protests. Also, in looking at countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Japan, where their governments negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to keep drug prices low in their countries. That is another way. And so it's not just extending patents, it's also if they take a drug and it's a capsule form and they make it into a liquid form, they can then apply for a whole new patent.
Right. Well, I've read from other sources, I've read about how they'll make some totally irrelevant change, some little meaningless tweak, and then be able to apply for a new patent and just keep it ongoing, even though it's the same thing.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
This you mentioned the intellectual property like patents and things, but it also has to do with the things under copyright and stuff. And there was this bill that public pressure stopped, this SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, that was a sweeping intrusion into people's right to share information. And public pressure stopped that from Congress, but that kind of concept is in the TPP.
There's huge concerns around that, and groups such as Open Media and groups that really feel the internet should be equally accessible, and that there should be this free flowing. And you think of the use of social media, you think of things like YouTube, and there's going to be, if this provision passes the way we understand it, there will be pressure for self-policing, and whether that's Yahoo or YouTube or Facebook having to do their own self-policing, and that if you have some small child singing some popular song, but they don't have the rights to be singing that song and it's up on YouTube, that it really is going to be putting unrealistic curtailments, and that obviously there's certain materials that people write and authorship that people create that they deserve to have resources come back to them, but this would go above and beyond.
Yeah, an example I saw about what would be at risk would be like you see a recipe from a book that your mom would like, so you copy and paste it into an email to say, hey mom, here's the recipe I think you'd like, and they could just nail you hard for that kind of thing. So it gets down to trivial things.
And it's how it's used, again, because I think there's certain things in the trade agreements, and they might be for a certain, the motive behind them is something that appears positive, but then as they're being interpreted and as they're being used, that's the big concern.
Well, and the interpretation is important. One of the things that I think you had mentioned earlier was the process of what would happen in a court kind of setting with this arbitration that's built into it. And it's not like we think of a fair court system with process and impartial judge. Tell us about what their arbitration process would be in case of a dispute under the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Sure, and the dispute, again, is a corporation finding problems with a country and a country's laws or a municipality's laws. And what happens is, again, the company sues the country, and the company and the country each get to pick one arbitrator, and these are not judges, these are attorneys. And then they agree on a third, and again, these are attorneys that sometimes represent the company, and then they have a whole array of different remediation in front of them, from dollar amounts. We just saw a recent case under NAFTA where Cargill sued the country of Mexico for putting a pretty high tariff on high fructose corn syrup. And Cargill said, you don't get to do that, Mexico. They sued them, and they were awarded $95 million. And so there can be any sort of monetary, again, this potential profit. They could compel them to change the law. It also creates a chilling effect where, and we're seeing it here in Washington State when we're starting to talk about whether it's buy local or supporting local businesses here. Immediately the question is, are we going to be out of compliance with our trade deals? Is this going to come back to us? And so I think there is the actual court case, but then there also is the chilling effect. And then it's whether countries can actually afford, because it's incredibly expensive to fight these cases, and they're using taxpayer dollars, these cases. So whenever the U.S. is defending itself, and the U.S. has actually, by and large, won our cases. It's the other countries that have been
Well, as
losing
long
the
as the U.S.
cases.
gets to beat the crap out of other countries, that's just
with,
consistent.
with our dollars, right?
Yeah, but it's consistent with the rest of the way the country seems to operate. But these arbitrators, they will rotate in. From what I've read, they would rotate in from giant corporations. So you might be like a vice president of a chemical company in Peru, and now all of a sudden you're an arbitrator and you're hearing cases about which you might have a conflict of interest, and then when your term is up as an arbitrator, you go back and you're a vice president at your chemical company again, or whatever it is. And likewise, any of these Pacific Rim countries that would be involved. I mean, it just seems like it's so full of blatant conflicts of interest, and it's like anybody who has a sense of what it would take to have a fair judicial process, this is not it.
Well, and we're talking about the U.S. Trade Representative's office that's negotiating this, and this is all happening in the executive branch.
Yes.
And the agricultural negotiator came from Monsanto, and the former head of USTR, Ron Kirk, came out of Philip Morris, and he said he was leaving USTR to go make some money. And so he's going right back into the corporate world. It's a revolving door.
Yeah, sell some more cigarettes. Some of the things I've read, I think, are accurate in saying this is really kind of like a coup, where business corporations are conquering democracies, conquering governments of nations, and getting more power than does that resonate with you, or is that extreme language?
No, we very much, that resonates with the language here. I mean, if you look at it in the sense of, and I don't want to kind of get into fast track.
We will in a moment.
Where we will. However, I mean, that is really a taking of our democracy here, where our elected leaders are not involved. I mean, we have elected one person into the executive branch, and he's all of these people who we don't necessarily feel are representing us, and then they put pressure on these different countries because you mentioned this was a Bush negotiated trade agreement, and Obama came in and he actually put a pause on for a year while his administration decided whether to take it up or not. And I think that is very telling because so often we hear we have to make all these concessions because we want to make the U.S. desirable to trade with. However, all of these countries waited for a year until the U.S. decided what we wanted to do. And so countries will do many things to trade with the U.S., and we're seeing it. They will make compromises. You know, Australia was holding strong on the investor state, and now they're starting to say, oh, well, you know, we really want to have, you know, we want to have access to the U.S. market. We are a very important market. And then similarly, countries like Vietnam and Malaysia are saying, well, we want investment, we want economic stability, and that will come when corporations hire our workers and train our, and when in reality that is not the case at all.
Well, and some of these governments have extremely business-friendly people heading up the executive branch. I mean, in Canada, Stephen Harper is, he's like so much in bed with the oil companies and other big business and against labor and against all the progressive values that we would think of as what Canada used to have. So of course he's enthusiastic about this. And Australia has had recently similar kind of stuff. So it's kind of like somehow these different nations have been able to elect extremely business-friendly people who will then all collaborate to have this thing that facilitates the coup where corporations overthrow democracies.
Well, it's interesting because even Japan, I mean, the TPP was part of the political debate in the last election in Japan, and the current prime minister ran on a platform to not get involved in TPP unless it protected farmers and did all these things. And then you heard about a meeting at the White House with the new prime minister and promises. And you know, and we should also point out that there's ongoing resistance here in the U.S. and there's resistance.
We're doing a TV show right now.
And all of the countries. Well, I mean, like in Japan, a small rally is 6,000 people, and so people are in the street. and putting pressure on their elected leaders who aren't representing them.
Well, is there anything else we need to know about the lack of transparency in the negotiation? We've covered that pretty well, and it may be that we should mention the fast track, which would be the next step. Tell us the concept of fast track. What is that?
Sure.
What does fast track mean? And then how would it pertain to this?
So fast track, the U.S. Congress, under the U.S. Constitution, has the authority to regulate foreign commerce. And so they basically should be the ones who are negotiating trade agreements. And however, the USTR, which is in the executive branch,
Trade Representative's
office, they are the ones that are doing kind of the diplomacy and are put in the role of negotiations. And so what they have said to Congress is that you need to give us your authority. So we will bring a completely negotiated trade deal to you. You will have very limited debate. There will be no ability to amend in any way, and you will simply be able to vote yes or no. Mm-hmm. And we had fast track under NAFTA. We had fast track under CAFTA, and fast track. So fast track is not attached to any one trade agreement.
And that started. Fast track started back in the Nixon era, isn't that right?
I believe so. Mm-hmm.
That's what I read someplace, and it's it's the kind of thing that should be an affront to the American people to have that kind of a thing.
To democracy.
And part of the damage I think that fast track causes is because this can't be adequately debated in Congress and can't be amended at all, it doesn't make any news. So not only is Congress kept in the dark, but the concept of fast track keeps the Trans-Pacific Partnership and these other free trade deals out of the public conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, an even worse affront to democracy than keeping Congress in the dark.
Absolutely, because
it's a news blackout caused by fast track.
Because Congress represents us, right? It's the branch of the people,
yeah, it should be.
More or less,
yes.
right? It's the branch we're supposed to have the most power and the most say.
But if they can't even talk about it, then normally you would get sort of the blow-by-blow coverage of what's happening.
Right.
But with fast track, the whole American society is being kept in the dark about this.
And there's a lot of pressure once it gets to Congress, and that's where we haven't been able to influence a deal once it comes to Congress. And where we have our power is in the negotiation process. And so if Congress is taken out of that, we lose our power to influence it in any way or to stop it.
How could we stop fast track?
So fast track, we can stop. So there's a step on fast track that's not attached to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right, that decision comes first.
Exactly, exactly. So that will be coming up for a vote in October.
Okay, and we're taping this program in mid-September.
Right, so
that vote would be in October.
Potentially in October.
Well, a lot of things are running slow on this anyway.
So it might not be happening.
People will be viewing this starting in early November.
Exactly.
When this program will start airing.
So hopefully the vote hasn't come up yet. Yes. And so we have been reaching out to our members of Congress, our senators, our representatives. Representative McDermott has already pledged to vote no on fast track.
As far as I know, he's the only member of Washington State's congressional delegation in either the House or the Senate who is clear. The others are saying, "Oh, it's for trade. Washington cares about trade. Let's just do it." There's a lot of that kind of
where we're not sure. We need to see what the fast track legislation says.
Yeah.
However, no, we've very excited that Representative McDermott has taken leadership in this and recognizing that he wants to be in it. He wants to be in the conversation, especially around the access to generic medicines. That's his important issue and how it will impact
people
communities.
Watching the show from Thurston County might not know that Jim McDermott is actually a medical doctor.
Yes.
So he knows these kinds of things. So. Yeah.
And knows the global repercussions, right? How communities in Africa are going to be impacted by the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Very much informed of all that. Yeah.
So our message is that our elected members of Congress in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and so they cannot give away their authority before they've actually seen the text. Yeah. And so by saying no to fast track, they're not saying no to Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're saying we want to have access to it, and we want to have input from our community, the people who have put us in office, our constituents. And so And fast track will just will continue, and there's trade agreements that are coming behind the Trans-Pacific
yeah.
Partnership that would also fall under fast track, and so that's why, from a democratic point of view,
Yes, this is a small d democratic, not partisan, but
right.
Those who care about democracy.
Yeah, exactly. Or the big D, democracy.
Yeah. I mean, at the scheme of things, but not the partisan.
Right. Not the Democrat versus Republican.
This is apart from partisanship. Yeah.
Exactly. So we're reaching out to the whole congressional delegation of
Well,
Washington.
the encouraging thing is that some years ago, the public pressure from people throughout the nation stopped the multilateral agreement on investment that had a lot of bad provisions in it, and we also stopped that expansion of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that was being negotiated in 2009 in Seattle.
Yep.
And so the public says, absolutely not. You're not representing us, and we won't allow it. And we were able to stop those.
And I would also add the free trade area of the Americas.
Yes.
Also went down because of huge pressure. There was a huge rally up at the Peace Arch around that.
Right. So even though the forces of politics and wealth are stacked against us, this is actually something that we can win with broad public organizing.
It's people pressure.
Yeah.
And that has always been the antidote to the rise of corporate power has only been checked by people pressure.
Yeah. And we should note that these things that we're talking about are part of another set of public policies around economics and things that, all around the world, banks and big businesses are grabbing more power and squeezing government, squeezing working people, squeezing poor people, squeezing governments, so that you have governments of some European nations going broke, and ordinary people, but the richest corporations and financial institutions and a lot of politicians have been encouraging more of the same, which squeezes people, and these austerity programs where they say, oh, well, the way to avoid defaulting on your debt is to cut poor, take away food, take away healthcare, take away education, privatize everything like we talked about earlier. And these are, and then they also say, oh, let's have shared sacrifice, but the people on top never sacrifice. It's only the middle class at the bottom. So these things we're talking about are sort of in this larger context where the whole push has been toward more wealth accumulation at the very top and more poverty from everybody, from the middle class on down. I just wonder if you could address that shared sacrifice, which is bogus, or the austerity programs that are so devastating.
Absolutely. Well, we've seen since the 1980s growing income inequality in our country, and at the same time, recently, we hear recession, right? And we all have to share in the burden. However, this is a golden age of corporate profits.
Yeah.
Corporations like Walmart and Monsanto are the winners in all of this. I think that's where it's important to talk about the winners, because they benefited from NAFTA. They're going to benefit from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so they want the status quo. This very much serves them. It serves their shareholders. And really it's on the backs of workers. And you see decline in union density, yet there's an increase in productivity.
Yeah. So these things are connected, and you can see the results when you look at what the banks in Europe are doing to, Spain or Greece, or this is all connected, and it's all about
orchestrated. It's all very orchestrated.
Yeah. And the banks that were too big to fail a few years ago are even bigger now.
And doing many of the same things.
And they're doing the same stuff.
Lessons have not been learned.
Nobody's been held accountable. Nobody's held accountable.
And they still have tax loopholes, right? Looking at the percentage that these big corporations are paying into the public coffers is a fraction of what you and I are paying.
And so when they underfund the revenue side of government can't afford schools, and the government can't afford roads or bridges or sewer systems, and all the public infrastructure deteriorates. And we have a crappier society for everybody, but the profits are up. This is the kind of thing that I think ordinary people have a gut feel for that's what's going on, but sometimes they don't lay it out in clear words. But
well, the corporations are shopping around, right?
Yeah.
And we see it here. I mean, with the corporations we have here, like Boeing and
Yeah.
Microsoft. I mean,
Yeah.
and Boeing was a Washington state company,
Right.
and we support them with our
well,
tax
they got
dollars.
all kinds of tax loopholes and stuff. They pretty much got anything they wanted from the legislature, and they still said, well, screw you, we're going to skip the union jobs here and go to an anti-union South Carolina
Right.
to build airplanes, and we'll move our corporate headquarters to Chicago.
And we're going to keep going further afield, overseas.
And, well, they're buying parts for their planes from Mexico and China and every place.
Right.
So they have no loyalty to us, and the legislature keeps giving them tax. It doesn't make sense. So besides the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there are some other trade deals ahead. There's a Transatlantic Free Trade Area, TAFTA. So that's coming up.
Yeah.
And you
Great
said that,
name, TAFTA.
yeah, but you said that there are more in the pipeline too.
Well, I
So-
mean, behind this, so this would really cover the Pacific Rim area,
yeah.
and then Europe, because Canada has an agreement with Europe, and so the U.S. wants to have an agreement with the EU.
Okay, I didn't know about Canada's.
Yeah, so they have one, and Mexico has one,
Oh.
and so we're getting involved, and so that's why we need to get this one right,
Yeah.
because the ones that come after will be very much modeled by what corporations are able to get.
Yeah. Now, the as we mentioned earlier in the interview, mainstream news media just have not been covering this stuff. The alternative press is onto it. So
Right.
I'll read other publications and sources through the internet and magazines and whatnot. I might even watch this TV program. Who knows? But the mainstream news media are just clueless. It's like a blackout. What could we do to generate more media coverage of the issues?
Absolutely. And I think writing in, we've gotten a number of opinion pieces and letters to the editor that we've gotten in, normally rebuttals, right? So I think there have been actually, not only has it not been covered, but there's been some positive coverage. I mean,
It's got the pro-business bias,
exactly.
the pro-corporate
And
bias.
the Seattle Times
Yeah.
editorial board, writes pro pieces about it all the time. And
Oh, wow.
the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when Japan came in, they were hailing how this is, even though we have a huge trade deficit with Japan.
Oh, yeah.
There's this sort of hailing of this, and so I think really kind of debunking the myths and challenging with facts,
Yeah.
right? What's out there and the potential problems that this could cause, and that this really isn't. It's being done in the name of labor. So we've partnered with a number of labor groups, and there's been a resolution at state level. And also different. I mean, the Democratic Party has passed as opposed to the Republican Party.
Yeah, but it's funny that the Democratic politicians don't listen to what the grassroots party membership has said through that resolution.
So we have to make them aware of these resolutions that are out there. And
Yeah.
I think we need to let people know about what's happening, because what we have found, when you poll people about NAFTA, 3/4 of the people that are polled feel that it has been one of the
people hate it.
biggest economic devastations we faced in the last 20 years.
People know that NAFTA was bad.
So
They
it's
need to
making
know
those
this-
connections.
yeah.
We have to be making these connections constantly.
Right. Well, you're executive director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. Fair trade would be, trade's okay, but you got to do it right. You got to do it honestly and ethically and with respect to the people. So, and that's a nonprofit organization that's working. That's a grouping of 66 other nonprofit organizations. So you got labor, religious community,
Social justice, environmental, family
so
farm.
That's a great base of grassroots support for the viewpoints that you're working.
And that's in Washington,
Yeah,
and then there
you're
are other
based in
state
Seattle.
campaigns that connect to Forum Citizens Trade Campaign, which is the national affiliate.
Well, I want
of
to put
ours.
in a plug for your group, and then we'll list some others, and we'll show
Sure.
them on the screen as well. You're with executive director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. The website is www.washingtonfairtrade.org, and the phone in Seattle is 206-227-3069. The Public Citizen, the group that Ralph Nader had founded long ago, has done a lot of good work on this. They have Global Trade Watch, one of their public citizen activities. That's globaltradewatch.org. Another nonprofit group is the Citizens Trade Campaign, www.citizenstrade.org. Another with an interesting name is Flush the TPP,
Yes.
which is at www.flushthetpp.org.
Exactly.
So there's a bunch of people working, and I know there are a lot of other groups working, the AFL-CIO and a bunch of
Absolutely.
groups
Friends of the
onto this.
Earth,
Yeah,
Sierra
yeah,
Club.
environmental labor and so forth.
And then also just one other, we created a cross-border network called TPPxborder.org, and that's activists in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico.
Oh, great.
And that's on
okay.
our website, so you can find out all that information on our website
Okay.
at washingtonfairtrade.org.
Okay. What else would you like viewers to do besides like write letters to the editor and get informed and stuff? And probably belong to. So if you belong to a union or a faith community or a denomination or environmental group, see what you're doing and plug in and work through your different affiliations.
Absolutely. Well, trade can connect to everything, and trade does connect to
Oh,
everything. Yeah. And so whether, as you say, it's a social justice faith organization or a labor organization, to be informing yourself about how trade agreements might impact the work that you're doing, and to be making those connections. So when you're advocating for whether it's climate change or labeling of GMO foods or immigration reform, to look at how trade plays into both the problem making as well as how trade could potentially challenge the hard-fought work of your communities. Yeah. And so by being smart on that, you can talk about it within the issues that you're working on.
And the examples that you gave just now are things that we have done past TV programs on. The genetically modified foods is the theme of our October 2013 program. We've done programs on immigration. We've done trade programs going back for years, WTO and everything else. So you can watch back issues through our website, which I'll mention near the end of the show. Great. So I want to thank Kristen Bifus. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. In recent decades, the gap between extremely rich people and everybody else has been widening terribly. This has caused gross injustices and horrible suffering in this country and around the world. Injustice and suffering lead to violence and war. The world cannot achieve peace while such economic injustices exist. The Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation wants our nation and the whole world to run their economies in ways that are fair to everyone, instead of ripping off people on the bottom in order to further enrich the people who are already rich at the very top. The free trade schemes that the powerful forces have been pushing through the governments of our nation and through mainstream media and through other nations have resulted in these kinds of gross injustices and horrible suffering. So instead of free trade, we need fair trade, fair for everybody. Instead of a few extremely rich elites running the economy, we need broad participation from everybody, a real democracy to shape an economy that will work for all of us. Fairness throughout the economy is necessary if we want peace and justice. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, and you can watch previous TV programs and get more information about a lot of issues at www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks. Quote, free trade, unquote, schemes that promise jobs and prosperity but have actually resulted in the opposite. For example, Bill Clinton, who ran as a Democrat, pushed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the expansion of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. George W. Bush started pushing for a free trade scheme that would include many Pacific Rim nations, and Barack Obama has pushed George W. Bush's free trade scheme even further. And that's what we'll be talking about mostly during this program. Mainstream politicians, mainstream news media typically assume that these free trade schemes are good, and they fail to adequately address the other side. This month's TV program will consider the other side. We need truly fair trade instead of so-called free trade. I'm delighted to welcome Kristen Bifus, Executive Director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, which is based in Seattle and consists of 66 varied organizations. Good to have you here, Kristen.
For having us.
Kristen and her organization and many other people and organizations Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympianship of Reconciliation. For nearly 27 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. For decades now, Congress and presidents of both of the big parties have been pushing for
Supports and subsidies within, and it just depends on who is who's benefiting from those subsidies. And so, in many ways, our markets, corporations are supported in our current markets. They're not free at all. I just want to challenge that concept of free markets, and then as you go down, then trade agreements that are predicated on that sort of ideology are broken.
Yeah. It occurs to me also that a lot of things are not well suited to a free market. You can't sell your children. You can't buy a slave. You can't sell your vote, put out a notice and have the different politicians bid up how much they would pay for your vote. A lot of things just do not work well in a free market. Slavery was a good example of that. And so I think we need to sort out as a society what things have overriding values and ethics that would not be susceptible to that kind of a brutal free market, let alone the fact that it's not even free to start with because of what you've talked about.
Well, and historically, we in the U.S. and other countries
are working hard to protect our jobs, our environment, and our democracy from giant corporations that would use a dangerous new free trade scheme to gain power and money at the expense of the broad public interest. So we have a lot to talk about, and this will be fun.
We do.
I want to start out in a kind of a larger context. To make better decisions about economics, we need to question some of the assumptions that policies that have been hurting our economy for so many years. Before we can consider the pros and cons of free trade, I want the American people to think about free markets more clearly as a concept. Mainstream politicians and news media keep assuming that a free market is the best way to handle any problem. And what do you think?
Well, I think there's this idea that a free market is unrestrained and has a certain naturalness to it, that goods and services will just flow and the market determine the value. Where actually, even those that advocate for so-called free markets or neoliberal economic theory don't actually acknowledge themselves that they're support